Today I would like to share a story with you folks about how Satan has been trying to stop Biblica, Uncion, Fuego, and Pastor Luis from being established in Siquirres, Costa Rica. Pastor Luis has been and Dita have been involved in their ministry there for about 10 years now, and throughout that time they've been attacked on all sides by Satan. In the first year or so that they started the church, they had found this building to hold services in. They started having services, and all of a sudden there were 4 people there that were threatening them. One day, these 4 people came with machetes and surrounded Pastor Luis at the church and said, "We don't want you to have a church here, and if you continue to having services, we're going to come back and chop your head off." And Pastor Luis obviously was scared and went to the Lord in prayer, and God told Pastor Luis to not be concerned, that he had all this in hand. And so Pastor Luis remained faithful to having services there, and shortly after this all took place, there was a big storm that came through the Siquirres, and the leader of this group of 4 took shelter underneath a tree and was struck by lightning and was killed. And the other 3 people in this group had a change of heart at that time. 2 of them today are Christians, and the third one kept coming by Pastor Luis's home and carrying his garbage away and trying to do things for him. Pastor Luis said today he doesn't know what happened to that individual because he moved away from town. But at the time that this all took place, those 4 people were involved in drug trafficking and that sort of thing. They were very bad people. Shortly after that, God told Pastor Luis that he wanted him to build a church compound on the property they're have today. And so Pastor Luis went to the owner of that property at that time and asked if it would be possible to buy that property to put up a church. And that individual said no, he wouldn't sell the land to him. Shortly after that, that person died. And one of his heirs approached Pastor Luis about a year later and said, "Are you still interested in that piece of land?" He said, "If you are, we'd like to donate it to you for a church." And so that's how Pastor came in control of this piece of property. About 5 years ago, Pastor Luis realized that he didn't have any documentation that this land actually belonged to the church. So he contacted a lawyer and started the process of getting the land registered in the name of the church. And so he hired a surveyor. They came in and surveyed out the lot and filled out the paperwork. And the lawyer said this will take 2 to 4 months to complete. About 5 years later, this hadn't happened yet, and Pastor Luis got word from a group of people in the area that he was squatting on their land. They apparently had realized that a lot of the property in this area had never been properly registered to the people that were using this land, living on the land, and that included the church property. And so Pastor Luis was scared and very, very likely in a position to lose the property to these people. And he went to the Lord in prayer, and the Lord said, "Don't worry, I've got this under control." And he said, God showed him a hand and said, "You're in my hand. Nobody can take you out of my hand." And but his lawyer said, because these people have money and that you're a your appeal hasn't been processed in 5 years. I don't think I think you're gonna lose your property. And then last December, sometime in the middle of December, around the 16th to 18th of December, Pastor Luis gets a call from this lawyer at 6:30 at night, and Pastor Luis says, in Costa Rica, no lawyer works past 5 o'clock. And so he was wondering why the lawyer was calling him. And the lawyer says, he says, I received a document today that I can't believe what I'm seeing. And this document says, is a judgment from a judge. It says, this property belongs to Pastor Luis Arguedas. And this judgment cannot be overturned. And he said up to that point, these people that were trying to do the land grab were coming around to him at the church and to a lot of people in the community saying, you got to pay us for your property and for your having a house on our property, and start paying us rent, or we're just going to come with a bulldozer and bulldoze it all down. He said after that judgment was pronounced, none of the members of the church that were living in this area were bothered anymore by these people. And so Pastor's very thankful that this judge, that God had moved this judge to save this property for the church. 1 month later, in the middle of January, he got word from the Biblica church that they were in financial difficulty and that they were in danger of the banks foreclosing on the church and putting the church in receivership. And when we were there on our mission trip, this happened. The banks took the Biblica church into receivership, and they went through all the individual churches. There's over 200 of them, and they cleaned out all their bank accounts. When the Biblica church cleaned out all the bank accounts of the churches of the Biblica organization, they could not touch the bank account at Biblica Uncion Fuego because those accounts were under the Pastora Adita's name and not the Biblica church. So the banks had no access to those accounts, and then they started taking possession of property owned by the Biblica church. But because the judge had issued the property not to the Biblica church, which Pastor said that's the way we submitted the paperwork, but the judge deemed the property my property, so the property's name was not in the name of the Biblica church. Our church was saved from the mismanagement of the Biblica organization as well. So that for the last 10 years, God told Pastor Luis he wanted him to have a church in Cicutas, and for the last 10 years, God has been doing extraordinary things to protect the efforts of Pastor Luis and Adita and Biblica Uncion Fuego to spread the good news of the gospel in Cicutas. And so God protected the finances, protected the property, and protected the whole mission, Biblica Uncion Fuego.